Greetings to everyone and welcome to our webinar, the Southeast Asia Climate Outlook Survey 2021 Report Launch and Discussion. In today's session, we will introduce key findings of the survey, along with a discussion with our panel of experts in regional climate issues and environmental policy. My name is Jia Hui and I'm from the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for their generous support of the 2021 survey. Later in the session, the panel will be holding a Q&A with the audience. Do submit your questions to the panel via the Zoom Q&A function, and remember to state your name and affiliation. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be shared online after the webinar. Now allow me to introduce Ms. Melinda Martinez, who will be taking us through the background of this survey. Ms. Melinda Martinez is lead researcher of sociocultural studies at the ASEAN Studies Center of ISEAS. I will now invite her to begin the webinar. Melinda, please.
Thank you very much, Yahui, for your kind introduction. Before we begin our panel discussion, I would like to give you an overview about our survey. Let me show you this. This Southeast Asia Climate Outlook 2021 survey is actually the second flagship survey conducted by our center annually. The survey aims to present a general view of climate attitude and awareness in the Southeast Asian region, as we know that the Southeast Asian region is often cited as being one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change. This year's survey is divided into 5 sections. It consists of first, respondents' profile, second, perceptions of climate change issues, policies, and action. Third, perceptions of energy, food security, and cities. Fourth, perceptions of climate change governance and green recovery. And fifth, perceptions of international cooperation. We conducted the survey online from June 11 to August 2nd, 2021. It comprised 32 questions in total, and we successfully drew a total of 610 self-identified Southeast Asian respondents from all 10 ASEAN member states. The survey was offered in English and translated into 4 languages: Bahasa Indonesia, Lao, Khmer, and Vietnamese. We employ a purposive method of sampling. We invited respondents through 3 main platforms. First, through electronic mailer to our center's database. Second, distribution of a web link on our social media platforms. And third, in order to boost more participation and representation, we conducted a limited Facebook ads campaign to target respondents from mainly Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and also Vietnam. Next, regarding the respondents' profile, as we can see here, we drew a total of 610 self-identified Southeast Asian respondents. The Philippines had the highest number of respondents, followed by Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Among the 5 age groups surveyed, the majority of respondents were youth aged 21 to 35 years old, followed by respondent age 36 to 45, 46 to 50, and so on. This survey saw a slightly greater response from women than men, with a difference of 5% between the 2 genders. Regarding the educational level, majority of respondents have completed a bachelor's degree or higher. Among this group, master's degree holders were the most represented. And last but not least, we saw a quite diverse pool of respondents regarding their affiliation. Most of the respondents are affiliated with academia at 37.2% and governments at 15.7%. Other groups such as students, business communities, civil society organizations, and media made up the next largest groups, comprising around 34% in total. Next, I would like to hand over the panel discussion to Ms. Sharon Sia, Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Climate Change in Southeast Asia Program and ASEAN Studies Center at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Melinda. Very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our second Southeast Asia Climate Outlook report. My name is Sharon. I'm the coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Center and the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program. So before we begin, let me introduce our discussants on the panel and then a few words about the flow of the program. We have with us today Pak Benny Suryadi from ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Project, ACCEPT, the first integrated ASEAN Energy and Climate Change project at the ASEAN Center for Energy, ACE. So ACE has been doing tremendously good work on the energy and climate nexus with the ACCEPT project. And it seeks to inform regional policymakers of the critical decisions that need to be made. Benny is an active advocate for greater regional cooperation and interconnectivity because he has been involved in the ASEAN Interconnectivity Master Plan Study 3, which is really the region's blueprint for electricity interconnection. And he's also an advocate for sustainability. So I can't think of anyone else better than to give his reactions and comments on ASEAN regional cooperation and energy issues. Our next discussant is Pak Wira Dylan. Pak Wira holds a master's degree in climate change policy and economics from the Australian National University. He has led a number of R&D programs covering the power sector, clean and renewable energy technology adoption. He's with Yayasan Indonesia Cera, a think tank, and he moonlights, interestingly, as a game master and has developed notably a board game called MEC, which is designed to help players simulate global issues around development and climate change. I'd love to play that game one day, Pak Wira.
Hopefully we can chat with them.
Yes. And finally, we have Mr. David Fogarty, climate change editor at the Straits Times Singapore. David has been covering science stories since 1986 and developed his strong interest in climate change before becoming Reuters' first climate change correspondent from 2008 to 2012. He also did a spot of media consulting for a group of US foundations focusing on environmental issues in Indonesia before he joined ST. I know for a fact that David is very passionate about climate change, and I really look forward to his views about the media and climate change and how we can all work together to improve on things. Now, a note about the flow of the program. We will dive into the results of the survey, stopping at various points to have a discussion with our panel. We welcome questions in the Q&A box, which may be picked up as appropriate either by myself or by the discussants. And then we will leave the last 15 minutes to take participants' questions that have not been answered throughout the session. Before we go into the presentation itself, there are a few findings that were similar to last year's report, which will not be highlighted in the interest of time, but which can be found in the report. And the report will be released at 4 p.m. today on the ISEAS website. These findings are, firstly, what people think are the most serious climate change impacts on Southeast Asia. The results are the same this year as it was for last year. The top 3 climate change impacts are floods, loss of biodiversity, and sea level rise. So there's no change. But what is interesting though for this year is that Indonesia, Philippines, and Singapore no longer consider loss of biodiversity as its top impact, but has replaced this with floods and rainfall-induced landslides, possibly connected to what we've been experiencing the last few months. The second finding is the level of climate advocacy. So Southeast Asians still remain largely passive by either sharing news or not participating at all. And the third finding, which we won't highlight, is whether governments should prioritize adaptation or mitigation. So majority of Southeast Asians chose both. Now, moving into the presentation proper. Okay. The first finding we thought we should ask our respondents was where they found their sources of climate information. So majority of them refer to major online sites, 44.1%, and online sources were particularly popular with Cambodian respondents. And of course, we already know this probably from what we read in the media. Those under 21 depend primarily on social media and online influencers as well as public figures. So there's no surprise that youths, almost 50% in this survey, were most dependent on these sources. Next. Next. So on the general view of Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia's general view of climate change, the majority recognize the importance of climate change, with Vietnam and Philippines showing greatest urgency. But this level of urgency decreases steadily across age groups, from 76.5% amongst those under 21 to only 62% amongst those who are above 60. Next. When we asked respondents who should bear responsibility for climate change, the top three choices were national governments, businesses, and individuals. And this is consistent across all countries except for Myanmar, whose respondents choose ASEAN. Next. On the cost of climate measures, again, we asked who should be bearing the cost. Here, 84.4% agree that businesses and industry should bear the cost of climate change, and 79% chose governments. The only exception was Laos. Very interesting here is that there is a mismatch in individual responsibility and the cost burden. So in the previous question, well, 69% of respondents feel that individuals are responsible for tackling climate change. Only 40% here think that individuals should bear the cost. So hereby implying that climate change measures should not result in individual financial burdens. And on the same plane, there's a significant proportion that say all stakeholders must bear the cost, perhaps as an indicator that the whole of society approach to climate change is now becoming a little bit more acceptable. Next. We also asked respondents whether more international public financial support should be allocated for developing countries to make a transition to low carbon economies. Here we have over 88% of respondents showing support for greater international finance allocation in developing countries, while 99.8% are unsure. And this support varies somewhat amongst the more enthusiastic group of countries. These are Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Myanmar, to the less enthusiastic group. And these are Thailand, Singapore, Philippines, and Brunei. Next. When we move on to the role of governments in reducing carbon emissions, we allowed the respondents to choose two of the highest options. So here, the top priorities for governments to take note are that the citizens expect them to encourage businesses to adopt green practices, to demonstrate public financial support, and to enact national climate laws. Next. We also asked respondents what they see the role of the private sector in reducing carbon emissions. Again, they were allowed to select two options. So here we have 78.7% of respondents feel that green supply chain practices must be prioritized in the private sector. This is the most popular option by far. 34.4% also say that there should be greater transparency and accountability in corporate sustainability reporting. And the second option is an investment in R&D and technology, for instance, in renewable energy adoption. In this question, public awareness campaigns were the least popular. I should also make note that there is stronger support for green investment and financing from civil society and NGOs, as well as regional organizations, intergovernmental and international organizations than from the business, finance, and industry sector. Okay, so these are the key findings on perceptions on climate change. Just want to pause here for a moment. There are no questions, but I would like to start with a first question of my own, actually. This is directed to David. Yeah. So you see that actually the finding on climate information sources, there's a large proportion of people moving away, not depending on major online news sites, but on social media. Do you think there is a greater danger of climate misinformation or disinformation, given that a large proportion of youths now depend on social influences on the social media platforms?
Definitely. I think, I mean, I'm a fairly regular Twitter user, so, you know, I see climate scientists on there and other scientists as well. And one of the things that they're trying to do is to combat misinformation carried by denialists or people who don't understand the issues properly, but also trying to encourage some media organizations to, you know, to be a little bit more accurate or even more proactive in their media reporting. So I realize, you know, the younger age group, the younger you get, the more they rely on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and many others. So it's a question of policing that to some extent. But of course, there's also the issue of how to really accurately police that with so much information out there. So it's a bit of a pity that the younger group sort of, I mean, it's good that they look for a variety of sources, but relying too much on influencers or certain news organizations, certainly the ones that have a more skeptical bent, can be a risk. And I'm not sure how to really fix that, except to keep on encouraging, you know, the younger readers to go to more traditional sources of news, such as the more mainstream media, to try to get a more balanced diet, if you want to call it that, you know, so that they can at least get a range of views and then make a better sort of informed choice.
I just want to open this up to Benny and Patwira. Are there any reactions to some of the findings that were shared, particularly on the role of the government and the private sector?
Well, I think it's very interesting to see that. I would say this might be a respondent selection bias, not the fault of the methodology itself, but the fact that when we are trying to get respondents for such an issue, we do tend to get the more educated ones, the ones with more access, and they are, I guess, a bit more aware of the potential role of business and governments. It will be interesting to see whether more grassroots people would have the same views. And that being said, I think it's interesting to see, especially for Indonesia, how they initially said that the government is always most responsible, but then in 2020 the second was individuals and the third business, but that changed in 2021. I wonder what happened. I have a suspicion maybe the COVID situation made people realize that, yeah, maybe we're not that powerful to change it. Maybe people in better situation, businesses in that sense, should do more.
Yes, that's right. I did note that there was quite a substantial, decrease in terms of the individual's responsibility from last year to this year. It could also be a factor of fatigue, maybe, after suffering from COVID-19 and all these various lockdowns over nearly 20 months now, that people feel, well, the government needs to take more responsibility. It shouldn't be me, right?
Indeed.
But Benny, anything from you?
Right, just a follow-up point being shared, that I think the understandings, it's one side is also a good point that where the respondent is having higher education, which which will be able to respond on the issue of the climate change as an integrated issue. It's not really looking as a one specific issue. You highlighted before what is the impact, whether the flood, whether the heat wave, because it's also still a gap of knowledge for many of us that how to associate talking about the climate change. It's going to be, is it flood? The climate change is associated with the flood, or climate change associated with this kind of heat wave, or also to some context, maybe later on the energy sector, that how that climate change is associated on the issue of the climate change. And just to add what David mentioned as well, it's going to be I'm quite active as well in the social media, the Twitters, where trying to put some kind of information that, but most of my followers, so-called followers, is the people who are already educated on this kind of topic. So I have Instagram, who is more personal, where more follower for youth, but it's more in the private use. But that's what's happening, that the discussion, I see it's a lot of also scientists trying to share their information about the climate change in a more easy ways to communicate in that Twitter. But the problem is how to get the youth also following that kind of the Twitter, or for people who are direct person. So it's also quite challenging. We have a lot of good scientists that of climate change advocacy. They're trying to distribute the information in easy to understand for many level of education, but somehow it's still a mismatch. And when we go to the detail, most of the follower is just this circle backs to people who are already engaged on the issue. So this is something that homework for everyone needs to be addressed. Thank you.
That's right. I feel you out, Pak Benny, because sometimes when I'm on social media as well, you kind of wonder, are you just, speaking and listening back to your own echo chambers? You're just kind of, reaffirming each other's ideas and perspectives about that issue at hand. And it might be quite a silo view in the end. Anyway, let me move on to the next section, which is on energy. Okay, so on energy, we asked a very pertinent question, which we asked last year as well, on whether we should cut reliance on whether ASEAN countries should cut their reliance on coal as soon as possible. So 79% of Southeast Asians feel this urgency. Respondents from Indonesia and Singapore are most likely to demonstrate this attitude, with both of them over 85% support. But the strongest disagreement came from Laos and Vietnam. And there's also a portion of respondents who are unsure whether there should be a cut in terms of using coal. Next. We also asked this question, would a reduction of dependence on fossil fuels be painful in the short term but beneficial to ASEAN economies in the long term? Do you agree? So you see here, over 83% agree that there will be short-term pain, but long-term gains in cutting fossil fuel dependency. The support from Singapore, Vietnam, and Indonesia is at least 1.23 times higher than the support from respondents from Thailand and Myanmar. So while no Myanmar respondents disagree with this statement outright, about 11.4% of Thai respondents, 7.1% of Laos, and 5.9% of Cambodia respondents disagree. But despite all of this, majority of them agree with the broad economic projection. Next. We asked whether there is potential for ASEAN to tap into the renewable energy sector, and it does appear that there is a consensus emerging across the region. So all the respondents from Brunei and Laos agree 100% that there is potential. Indonesia, Singapore, and Vietnam trail closely behind with over 95% of support. Cambodia and Myanmar respondents are less enthusiastic about the potential for renewable energy at the regional level. Next. On a scale of 0 to 10, we asked, how confident are you that ASEAN will achieve its 23% target share of renewable energy in the region's total primary energy supply by 2025? Here we have Vietnam, Philippines, and Laos respondents demonstrating strong confidence that ASEAN will achieve its target. Singapore and Malaysia are more skeptical. They express less confidence in this target. Next. On a scale of 0 to 10, we asked, how confident are you that adopting climate change measures and policies will drive the innovation and competitiveness of your economy? ASEAN respondents are generally confident that taking these measures will help their economies. Here we have Vietnam, Singapore, and the Philippines demonstrating greatest confidence that climate policies will help them. And in terms of affiliation, students, regional organizations, and media respondents are most confident. Next. We also asked questions about food supply, food security. My country's food supply is threatened by climate change, example, food imports and self-production use. Do you agree? The rate of agreement here has actually increased from the last year's results of 72.3%. Now we see 81.1% of respondents saying that their country's food supply is threatened by climate change. So amongst the respondents, those from the Philippines, Vietnam, and Singapore are most concerned about food supply. Meanwhile, Cambodia has the highest proportion of respondents who are not concerned about food security. And across all countries, the proportion of respondents that are unsure about this issue is highest in Thailand at 28.6%. Okay, next. We also asked if their country has a policy and a plan to safeguard agriculture against climate change. Here we see a high level of uncertainty among the respondents. Most of them are unsure if their country has a plan, but around 22% of them disagree. So only 21% say that their country has a policy, and the proportion of those that agree that they have a policy is higher in Laos, Vietnam, Brunei, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Singapore. And again, Thailand, Thai respondents show that by far they disagree at 37%, followed by Malaysia at 35%, Brunei also at 35%, and the Philippines at 26%. So there's quite a significant proportion of people who are unsure if they have national plans for climate resilient agriculture. We'll stop here for a bit of reactions from our discussants. Is there anything here from the set of results that stood out for you?
I might start first if I'm allowed that to be. Yeah, I mean, the initial finding is very interesting when you're saying that Indonesia and Singapore respondent is the highest who saying no to the call. I mean, Singapore context perhaps easy to understand. It's not rely on the call, but hearing this from the Indonesia respondent, I think it's a good news, perhaps to Wira as well. That's something that's very, very interesting on how they, because I mean, we hope this voice can be translated into the action as well, to recognition by the government as well. So it's very interesting that how the Indonesian respondent stated on this kind of point, and in particular that nothing, I mean, we're talking only like for the next 5 years, there's still many gigawatt of coal is being injected to the country based on the current existing power development plan of each countries. And another finding is, I think, is also interesting. I mean, the optimism of the region towards the achievement of renewable energy target. I mean, I understand that. I mean, all of us agree with this region has a significant potential in renewable energy. I mean, if we talk about the solar, I mean, from our studies only, if we utilize like 4% from the potential, we can already have a very good renewable energy. But the optimism that could be achieved, it's something challenging. I cannot say I'm not optimist because I'm part of the people who are responsible to push this to be achieved by 2025. But it's also very interesting to learn that Vietnam is having also very good optimism. If we back to the data that we have from last year alone, I mean, also maybe a lot of people is also know Vietnam government is doing very, very good job on renewable energy, where they install more than 10 gigawatt of solar power plant in 1 year alone. So I think this is also being translated that how they see that there is a potential, and then there is optimism that something that we can do in a better way to push this renewable energy target. I stop here. Thank you, sir.
Mira?
Right. Well, I think Pak Benny just took everything I wanted to say. I think the standout result was how optimistic Vietnamese people are, and I think that's a very good sign. Again, I think that means that the government is ambitious enough, and they are putting their money where their mouth is, so they are showing that this can work. Like Indonesia had a big, hullabaloo about Sidrap, our wind farm, but sadly we seem to know that it's a bit underutilized. There are issues about power purchasing and distribution in those areas due to previous contracts. Let's not get into the details, but I think the lesson learned for governments in the region here is that if you do big projects and you deliver on it, you focus on renewable energy, ASEAN has it, and we can do it, and you will get support from your constituents. So hopefully we can explore that messaging more, and thank you ISEAS for making this report, and hopefully this will resonate more with policymakers to push for that renewable energy transition so that we can actually get the 23%.
Yeah, that's right. And actually one of the results that we will touch on later is whether stimulus spending has contributed to green recovery, and that's somewhat linked to the coal usage as well, because you will see across the region that governments have actually been using the easy stimulus dollar, which is to provide fuel subsidies to the population, and that's something that is quite hard to wean off, especially during a crisis situation where people need help the most. Okay, I'm just going to sort of move on to the next section. On the perceptions of cities, so these are only 2 questions here we've posed. 89% of our respondents were actually resident in Southeast Asian cities. We do accept respondents who are not resident in this part of the world but consider themselves as Southeast Asians from the 10 ASEAN member states. So here, due to time constraints, we will highlight Jakarta and Singapore's priorities, but if you read in the final report, there were actually more than 14 cities that responded to us on what were the top 3 climate change mitigation and adaptation priorities. So just looking into this data, recycling measures, renewable energy adoption, and the promotion of public transportation are top priorities across all ASEAN urban areas. And the residents of Jakarta metropolitan area prioritize promotion of public transport, vehicle emissions control, and renewable energy adoption. Whereas residents of Singapore prioritize renewable energy adoption, energy efficiency measures, and recycling measures. In this question, we gave them a total of 9 options to choose from, and these are the top ones. So in that little battery you see there, the top measure appears to be recycling measures. Next. On adaptation, we asked which are the top 3 climate change adaptation measures your city or residents should prioritize. And again, we gave them 9 options, ranging from air quality measures to water catchment measures. So across all of ASEAN, residents believe that their cities must prioritize green restoration of public spaces, flood protection, and air quality measures. Residents of Jakarta prioritize air quality measures, flood protection, and green restoration. So perhaps no surprise here, because Jakarta residents have been suffering from intense flooding as well as pollution arising from transportation. The residents of Singapore, very interestingly, prioritize climate proofing of infrastructure, coastal protection, and flood protection. Again, perhaps it's a reflection of what of the intense rainfall that Singapore has been experiencing in the last month or so, and also the fact that sea level rise, you notice, was actually a top concern for Singapore. So among these climate adaptation measures, actually disaster early warning systems, natural disaster evacuation plans, and coastal protection were the least favorable measures amongst all respondents. And this view can be an indicator that not all respondents are fully aware of the risks of climate disasters in the future and the need to improve preparedness. So here, the researchers who worked on this section feel that local governments can help to raise awareness of these problems and promote an understanding of these least favorable measures to boost the buy-in of their residents. I'm going to stop here and actually invite my colleague Melinda. She works on ASEAN Smart Cities to get her reaction on this portion of the survey.
Sharon, I think maybe I will comment for the adaptation first. I feel that the result is not surprising at all, that Southeast Asian urban residents, they are mostly concerned with flooding and also sea level rise, and they prioritize green restorations due to the fact that I think most of Southeast Asian urban areas are located in the coastal areas. Cities like Jakarta, cities like Ho Chi Minh City, also Manila and Singapore, we are located in coastal areas. Also, some cities like Kanto, Siem Reap, Phnom Penh, they are referring. So I think the concern of flooding is very, very strong in those cities. I'm not surprised, but what I'm surprised is actually on the mitigation view. They feel that the local government must prioritize renewable energy adoption, which is for me quite interesting because we've never heard that local governments announce their ambition in renewable energy shares. I've never heard that the city of Manila promised that they will increase their renewable energy share in 2030 by maybe 50%, something like that. Usually the ones who announce their renewable energy adoption is the national government, because Southeast Asian, the provision of energy in Southeast Asia is quite unique, I would say. The remit of renewable energy, the remit of energy is usually under the national governments. Even in countries like my country, Indonesia, energy is provided by state-owned companies, not by municipal companies. Yeah, for me, it's very surprising that urban residents want their municipality to increase their renewables share. Maybe Mas Beni, he has more experience working with national government and local governments. Maybe Mas Benny can share his view regarding this.
Thank you, Melinda. If I allow to chip in a bit, Sharon. This is quite a unique situation. I mean, it's going to be a case for us in the specific on energy issue. The power plant is far away from the city. So as a citizen, in Jakarta there are some few nearby, but we don't directly interact or see that. So it's not, at some point, it's not really a connected issue for us, for the citizen. For us, it's only, okay, I have electricity, and then it's cheap, it's affordable, it's available. So this is where the issue, but not all of it indicated that who are providing it, so who are generating this kind of thing. And also at the experience, we have ASEAN Smart City Network. To the limited knowledge that I have learned, it's very little or almost none of this country on the list really looking the small city in the perspective of energy. We have one example from Thailand, one city in Thailand, I think, that are including the energy part as in their concept of the smart city, but the rest is not. So I'm not saying that the concept is wrong, but disconnecting the issue with the energy, I think is something that needs to be resolved. Perhaps we have Bali as a good example, where the local government has putting some policy initiatives to having a renewable energy. So it looks like as the municipality authorities being responsible, where the community or we as a citizen know also to who to communicate this kind of issue. If we are communicating to the utility company, something is not disconnected from our daily life. We pay the bill to them, yes, but we have no idea how to convey, how to communicate with them, rather than complaining about our bills. But to the municipality authorities, part of the citizen, that they are the one who can communicate with us, who we can have a discussion that how to drive a better sustainability for our region. That's a short view from me. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Pak Wira who wants to make a comment.
Yeah, if I may make a comment, I think it might have something to do with the fact that, for example, rooftop solar has been has become more accessible in the last 5 years, especially. So I think that may have caught the imagination of the citizenry, and they feel that with a little bit of push, because they can't rely on the national government, because when you want to move to make a big power plant project, then you do need national government. But for smaller projects, there is a possibility to get local governments included. One of the examples in Indonesia, they have Gerakan Nasional 1 Juta Solar Atap, which a national movement for 1 million solar panels, and that movement is still relatively small, but they have created lots of jobs, and they have gotten some major artists involved. So I think some people do know of that, and that might be a similar situation with the other countries.
Interesting point about solar panels being an option for the residents. And David.
Yeah, so just a couple of points just to follow up on Pak Benny and Pak Wira. Definitely, certainly from an Australian point of view, for example, there's obviously lots of wind and solar, and I think solar really took off partly because the costs came down, partly because rooftop solar is very visible, and it's also that sense of being sort of semi-independent, right? Plus getting money back from the grid, so people kind of like that idea. The other thing with Jakarta, I agree with Melinda. It's very interesting that for a city like Jakarta, that people would still rate renewable energy as their top mitigation choice. But as anybody who's lived in Jakarta will know, one of the key reasons I suspect people eye renewable energy as a good solution is not so much for climate change, but for air pollution. You know, it's a practical thing. We've seen in Indonesia, particularly in Jakarta, lawsuits against the government trying to stop any new coal-fired power stations. We've seen that with Jawa 9 and 10, which unfortunately is going ahead, partly funded by, you know, interesting consortium of Asian banks, including DBS. So I think the civil society campaigns against coal-fired power stations, not just in Indonesia, although there have been quite a number, Greenpeace has been very active, particularly also in Vietnam. I think that's also helped shift public opinion towards renewable energy. It's also the costs, the technology costs. And you've also seen, obviously, very quite heated campaigns in the Philippines as well. And the third thing, I think it's the availability of finance. It's I think that finance, it's clear, is there now. And it's not just from local banks, it's from international banks, it's from pension funds. You know, there's a lot of interest in the Southeast Asia or ASEAN growth story. This region is growing quickly, it needs lots of energy. There's also the diplomatic pressure on governments. You see that particularly again in the run-up to COP26. You know, the UN says, you know, we should not be approving any more sort of new coal-fired power plants, and we should be trying not to, you know, entrench too much gas, you know, LNG power. You know, and the International Energy Agency earlier this year came out and said no more oil, gas, you know, basically no more fossil fuel investments from this point on. So all of this sort of adds to an environment of, well, what are the alternatives? You know, greener is cleaner, basically. That seems to be the message for this part of the world, and particularly for Manila, Bangkok, and particularly for Jakarta. That's kind of my take on it.
Wira, you indicated you had a comment.
Yes, spot on, David. And I think just in the last hour, they did accept the lawsuit, citizen lawsuit for air pollution in Jakarta. So that's a win, I guess. And I think maybe the COVID situation also had something to do with it, in the sense that at least in 2020, when everyone was on lockdown, I think most major cities, especially Jakarta, they had people on Twitter posting pictures on how the city cleared up. So I think that caught the imagination of people and will definitely have an effect.
So the COVID-19 pandemic showed us a possibility of what a healthy environment could be.
Yep.
Ironically. And also interesting that, you know, the idea that small-scale renewable energy options are much more attractive to the residents who want to make a difference than to just rely on national infrastructural plans to do that. Okay, let's move on to the next section on governance and green recovery. So we asked respondents, do you think climate policies and laws in your country are aligned with the target to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? We note that all 9 ASEAN countries have submitted an updated nationally determined contribution as of August 2021, except Myanmar, which is understandable with the troubles that they are facing now. But respondents are almost evenly divided in their responses regarding their country's policies and laws. So respondents from Malaysia at 59.4%, Brunei at 52.9%, and Thailand over 51% do not think that their country's climate policies and laws are going to contribute to Paris goals. Uncertainty is also common among respondents from Laos and Myanmar. Meanwhile, respondents from Cambodia and Singapore have the highest certainty that their country has policies and goals that are aligned with Paris. Next. We also asked respondents to rate their national government's policies and actions taken in support of climate change. So here, majority, over 46%, believe that their governments are aware but not taking enough actions to tackle climate change. However, 41.8% of Singapore respondents feel that their government has acted enough, compared to only 2.9% of Thai respondents. And 45.7% of Thai respondents and 41.6% of Myanmar respondents say their governments are not paying enough attention to the climate emergency. Next. Our question on ASEAN working together effectively to tackle climate change. We asked respondents whether they see evidence of that. So overall, only 31.8% agree that ASEAN is working together effectively. 60% of respondents from the media disagree. And well, not surprisingly, I suppose maybe some ASEAN respondents were there. Over 48% say that they agree ASEAN has been cooperating. But overall, we note that the level of uncertainty among respondents has actually increased from last year by 8.4%. So this means that ASEAN needs to advance its work, such as the development of the ASEAN power grid to help the region transition to a more efficient and sustainable future. Next. We then asked, how can ASEAN governments collectively combat climate change? And they were given two options to select. So the most popular options are investing in renewable energy, establishing regional forest conservation and restoration programs, and encouraging businesses to set emissions targets and disclose climate-related data. Carbon pricing was the least popular option, but it did receive support from about 35% of Cambodia and 25% of Vietnam respondents. So it's quite interesting when we compared the results here with the earlier published UN People's Climate Vote. These were quite similar options that about 1 million people participated in that survey, and they were almost similar options. Next. We asked the same question that we did last year. Which of the two crises, COVID-19 or climate emergency, should governments prioritize? Consistent majority here across all countries, reaffirming that both are of equal priority. But the strength of this opinion varies. And this is despite the worsening COVID-19 situation in many ASEAN countries. So at the time when we launched the survey, the Delta variant was just beginning to make its rounds in Southeast Asia, and it still is wreaking havoc in many countries in this region. So 76.5% of Cambodia respondents prioritize both, the highest amongst the ASEAN countries. But in terms of age groups, only 42.3% of respondents aged 46 to 60 prioritize COVID-19. I'm sorry, there's a typo there, compared to 25.6% of respondents aged 21 to 35. Let me see. Yeah, that's right. So our key takeaway from here is that despite whatever respondents have been going through over the last 20 months, when in fact they should be more concerned about COVID-19, they have continued to place equal priority on the climate emergency. So I suppose for those of us who are advocates, this is quite good news, and hopefully it stays that way. And governments do need to start listening up and putting equal resources to those issues. Next. We couldn't help it, but we had to ask a question about stimulus spending because we've been tracking the amount of dollars spent by governments in this region from last year to this year. So nearly half of the respondents feel that government's stimulus spending did not contribute to a green recovery. And in fact, over 55% of respondents from business, finance, and industry chose no. You'd be quite surprised because many of the stimulus packages and measures were actually targeted at helping businesses stay afloat during the season of the pandemic. And 50% of Laos and 37.5% of Vietnam respondents actually said yes, it contributed to a green recovery. So what are the key takeaways? I think clearly people are not seeing any evidence of long-term sustainability geared spending by the governments, even though I have to say, I think many of us have actually been beneficiaries of some of the stimulus dollars, either by way of electricity subsidies or fuel subsidies or wage subsidies. Yet we do feel that these are quite low, they're really low hanging fruits that the governments have made investment in and has not and will not be bearing any green fruits in the future. Okay, I will stop here and just get some reactions from the panel.
If I may start first, yeah. I have 3 comments. The first one, it's not really surprising about the respondent from Thailand on their government effort on this addressing the climate change. But what I would like to highlight is especially particularly on NDC. In fact, actually, in the latest NDC, updated NDC by government of Thailand, the climate change is already addressed at the highest policy levels under the national strategy. So there is quite an improvement actually compared to the first NDC, even though this is something many homework that need to be done, especially in the details, and also how to properly communicate it to the public, to the citizen. And the second point is on the issue of the energy and climate change cooperation. Yeah, I mean, this it's not surprising. Even this is also as Sarah introduced that I'm part of our project, the ASEAN Center for Energy, what we call it ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Projects, where we are trying to make the people from the energy sector and the climate change sector is sitting down together to discuss this issue collectively together. So it's not addressing by one side only. But it's indeed it's a very challenging work. I mean, as all the colleagues also know, I mean, it's going to be speaking in the national context. We have Ministry of Energy, we have the Ministry of Environment, we have Ministry of Economy. Each of them have the different objectives, different goals that need to be aligned, and that's on the national level. And also, if we are bringing this to the regional level, that's another challenge that we need to address. Many of them, perhaps some of you already know, we have ASEAN Working Group on the climate change. Now, this group is trying to populate all the idea, all the input from the each sectoral, especially towards COP26 in the coming months to address the joint statement by the region. This week happening is the Minister on Energy meeting and also Economic Minister meeting, which among the issue is also to address how we can solve together, collaborate together on addressing this energy and climate change issue. Last point on the COVID-19 pandemic, I have a divided feeling on this context. I mean, I totally agree with the respondent as well that, and if we look the data, is most of the budget spending by the government is not into the sustainability part. I mean, it's a fact, it's a data. But what I say, it's also a mixed feeling based on the data that we have, particularly on the power sectors. Last year, the ASEAN, all of the 10 countries cumulatively installed the new power plant is about 22 gigawatt as a whole. So Indonesia, Brunei, Cambodia, everyone is in Sabah. So we installed last year during the COVID-19 pandemic. Last year is 22 gigawatt, and 82%, So I'm saying it's 82% of this new installed capacity is renewable. So be it from the solar, be it from the hydro, biomass, it's coming from the renewable. So this is considered the first trend of ASEAN. I mean, it's going to be where the new capacity on renewable energy, not only overlapping the fossil fuels, but 82% compared to 18 is quite significant delta, right? So this is where I mean, we still need to look what's going on in 2021. I mean, it's going to be because somehow what is being installed in 2020 is also a continuation from the previous one. So it's not really impacted by the COVID-19 yet, perhaps, but 2021 will be a turning point for the government, for us, and whether we are continuously going to that kind of direction, having more renewable energy, or back to the situation where we have belonged before. I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that piece of information about new capacity being 82% centered on renewable. Anyone else with a comment in regard to what Benny said? Yes, David.
Yeah, so just to pick up on what Benny said, I mean, it's encouraging that additional power generation capacity is largely renewable. I think that's a good news story. And as he said, we'll have to wait and see what impact COVID-19 spending plans will have on future power investments. But hopefully, it will continue in that sort of same direction, given the growing opposition, certainly to coal at least. I think it's also encouraging that renewable energy, once again, is again listed as a top option for action for ASEAN governments. I think that's a positive thing. It's also positive. So sorry, I just have to remember the chart. It's also positive that the equal treatment of COVID-19 and climate change. I mean, COVID-19 is a more immediate threat, and it's a threat to life and livelihoods. Of course, governments are going to rapidly focus on that, but it's good to see that at least public opinion is that we should not lose sight of the climate change threat, because that will still be here when the pandemic is long gone, right? So I guess it's not surprising to find that generally the spending plans of governments, most of whom are cash strapped, and a lot of them have used up a lot of their reserves in fighting this pandemic. I think really maybe only Brunei, certainly Singapore, maybe Malaysia have still got something in reserve. So that's not, to me, that's not surprising. The key thing is what happens from 2022, 2023 onwards, right? Do we then get back onto a greener track? I guess we also have to wait and see what happens at COP26. If that's going to be a good outcome, positive outcome, that will certainly have some momentum. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think you're right about the governments having to really just tighten their purse strings. There's been reports of governments, parliaments actually raising the debt ceiling for the country. The one instance is Malaysia. Prior to the change of prime minister, they had the parliament agreed to raising their debt ceiling. So one trend we might be seeing would be, the rising borrowings, increased in borrowings from the regional governments to support the recovery plans.
One thing I'm hoping that will not happen is that we slip back into the old narrative that climate change is a costly thing, that we should only do it if we could afford to do it. I think we're long past that narrative, and the IPCC report that came out last month really put paid to that narrative that climate change is a luxury. Fighting climate change and green investment is sort of it's a nice sort of luxury. That's just no longer the case anymore. So I'm hoping that governments, while they're cash strapped, they can still be able to find those reserves and still find outside investors to come in once the pandemic is largely on the wane.
Weera, your response?
Yes, I mean, I agree that there's lots of reason to hope for good news, but sadly, when recovery plans are not specified to promote green recovery, then the incumbents will garner the bigger share. So I think that's an issue, and I mean, we should still keep hope up and still work for it. But I think the fact, even though the IPCC report comes out saying all that, I don't think it has resonated or it has clicked yet with most policymakers to really urge them to make that shift. So I think reports like this are also important, and we need to keep telling them that, hey, your constituents are also going to support you if you go for more renewables.
Thank you so much for your responses. I'm going to move to the very last section of the survey, which is on international cooperation. So we asked the respondents which country has demonstrated climate leadership to help the world achieve Paris-aligned goals. And basically, we have 30.7% of all respondents believe that the EU has demonstrated strongest leadership in the absence of global climate leadership over the last few years. And this view is shared mainly by Vietnam, Thailand, Brunei, Singapore, and Indonesia. But you would like to note, of course, that almost an equal number, 26%, actually say none of these countries have demonstrated climate leadership. So we call them a group of skeptics who remain cynical about the state of climate leadership. And this view is particularly strong in Malaysia. Meanwhile, Japan is the second front-runner for global climate leadership, and they appear to be the first choice in the Mekong countries of Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and the Philippines. Next. And so with that question, we also had to ask which country they would like to see play a more proactive role in sharing their climate expertise, practical abilities, and technical know-how. Again, the EU, no surprise, is the most trusted partner in sharing expertise, capabilities, and technology know-how. Japan is the second most trusted partner in this region, and at the country level, again, top choice for Cambodia, Laos, Brunei, and Philippines. What was really interesting is that the US, that was previously ranked quite poorly in the previous question at 4%, they've come up to 16.4%. So clearly showing that this region actually have expectations of the US playing a more proactive role. I will stop here and now get any reactions at all to the international cooperation aspects, and then we can move to questions from the audience.
A short reaction. I'm not advertising my projects, but I mean, Norway is one of the leading countries who are really supporting ASEAN on their foreign energy and climate change. So, but it's not commonly public, so nobody knows also as well on that point of view. But also the interesting thing to learn that you and how the I mean, one interesting point that I would like to highlight when we're talking about the international cooperation is also the question to understand their obligation on their sides to support the ASEAN countries. I mean, how this is also the question can be asked maybe in the next one. That could be how seeing them is just international cooperation, so it's more on the expectation to play a role, or it's obligation for them to do their role to support the country in the region addressing the climate change issue. Considering, I mean, one fact is also that what happened today is also many of that's contributed to the developed countries who are, using coals before from their region. So this is the point that also is very interesting to learn from the issue on the international cooperation. So it's not only helping them to play a role, but it's also to look from the perspective of the obligation for them to play the roles. Because otherwise, if only relying to our own countries together. I mean, in ASEAN countries, I said that we aim to have the 23% of renewable energy share collectively. I mean, if we only look the individual countries, it will only land it around 16 to 17%. So if the each country is only is only doing it individually, but with the regional energy grid integration, including the recent, yesterday, LT, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia and Singapore signed an agreement to have the renewable energy coming from Laos to the Singapore, then we can do better to achieve this 23% target. So at that point, maybe this is a personal view that how we see the international cooperation is also obliged to support so that we can escalate this process together. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Pak Benny. So it seems that ASEAN has an impetus, a role to play in convening that kind of international support and cooperation from its dialogue partners as well. Any other comments? Oh, Pak Wira, yes, I see your hand.
Yeah, so I think the perception is definitely correlated with the fact that people, especially who are quite well educated, connected, or urban, would know if there are projects. JICA is always there. EU especially has taken the slack from the US, and especially I think for the last 25 years, they have clearly, the EU, have clearly done so much more in terms of environmental regulation, etc., taking up from US EPA previously. So that affects that, and it is true what Pak Benny said, that yes, developing countries are slacking as well in terms of climate action, but it is important to note that developed countries have also not paid their fair share under the Paris Agreement to, to make sure that funding is available at the scale. I think it was $100 million. I think. So yeah, we keep having COPs and we keep having negotiations, but issues from COPs 30 years ago remains the same. There's issues about fairness and equality, and that it is a very hard and wicked issue. But the faster we can agree on something, and if ASEAN ever becomes a super bloc in terms of negotiations, that might actually help the region, because I don't think ASEAN has taken a really huge role in negotiations. Most ASEAN countries in those COPs have acted on their own interest.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, we have 3 minutes to go, and I just want to address two of the questions that's still in the Q&A box. One is by Tony Zola from the GMS Research Center, asking why we did not include farmers, agriculture extension workers, disaster prevention officials, and commercial and agribusinesses in the survey. Well, Tony, we would love to, and we had actually hoped that some of these constituents, if you may, the part of the climate constituents would come onto the survey. And we thought that an online survey had a best, well, given certain conditions, best reach out to people who presumably, even if you were a farmer, you might own a device and you can take a survey on it. And that was why we chose to translate the survey into 4 other languages. And we certainly hope to be reaching out to more of these constituent groups in the next few years to try and gather more of their views and perhaps, drill down to some of the reasons behind those views. And we have another question from Kunapichai, who I don't know if any one of us is able to answer this question about ASEAN. Yes,
allow me to answer on that one. The first climate change status report is ready. It's going to be published soon, towards the COP26. That's the first question. The second one is, if any of you is looking to the joint ministerial statement of the 39 Energy Minister meeting yesterday, there is a plan to set up the ASEAN Climate Change Center. It's also soon, as I highlighted before, is bringing the energy and climate change people and all the other sectors sit down together. Addressing this issue is not an easy thing, but it seems to be launched a public this year. That's all I can respond to that question at this point, Sarah.
Benny, where will this center be located in?
It's part of the leadership of the chairmanship of the Brunei Darussalam. So it will be part.
So it's Bandar Seri.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. That's great. I'm just going to ask all our discussants to, share in one or two sentences what you hope to see at COP26, because obviously all eyes are on that meeting. What do you hope that can be achieved out of that meeting? Maybe starting with Patwira, and then David, and then Benny.
Well, I guess a starting point will be something to agree on after all these COPs. Something to agree on, something we can really push forward that is applicable, because we've had the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, but I guess they didn't really get to some of the important details to make it workable. And hopefully, because the Kyoto Protocol is going to be done this time around, so we need something, and to ensure all the other mechanisms actually fall into play and actually get something on the ground.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we definitely need some positive news. We've not had enough this year. We've had enough bad news on climate change in terms of impacts, but we've not had enough in terms of commitments on emissions, certainly not enough on finance for poorer nations, certainly not enough for loss and damage for poorer nations. For far too long, poorer nations, the developing world, most vulnerable nations have missed out on really being properly represented and having their views heard and being included in global climate action. So a lot of these countries, as we all know, are the smallest emitters, and yet they are among the most vulnerable. So there has to be there has to be a really, for once and for all, a proper statement on financing, where it's going to come from, where it's going to go. There should be a lot more on adaptation. That to me will really help mobilize action across developing nations. It will get much needed buy-in. For far too long, poorer nations have really just felt sidelined. The climate negotiations have always been much more the remit of the wealthy or the most influential. I've been going to COPs for many years as well, so I kind of share Pakwira's sort of feeling that much is said, but little is actually agreed. But we do have the Paris Agreement, and the basic architecture for that is good. We now need urgently for the remainder of the rule book to be for that Paris Agreement, particularly carbon pricing. Yeah. We need a global carbon pricing package to be agreed. That is also crucial. There's a long laundry list for Glasgow, and I'm not sure that many will actually get the tick. This has been agreed. I just don't sense the same mood of going into Paris, much less during Paris. I was there for the full 2 weeks for Paris, and that was by far the most positive and well-run COP I'd ever been to. Glasgow, I'm having my doubts about. Sorry, I don't think the British have got. Sorry, I hope there's nobody from the British High Commission on this call. I think they're trying their best, but I just don't think they have quite. And partly this is also because of the pandemic, but they don't have quite the same momentum going in from the French diplomacy, but from also we had the very different situation of the US and China being united on climate change, and right now that we just don't have that, which is quite. So that to me is one of the biggest, not the only one of the biggest dangers, I would say.
And also, the pandemic has really created these complications on so many fronts and so many levels. For instance, that unequal representation that we've already seen pre-pandemic from the developing and the least developed countries, largely due to inability to travel, lack of budgets, lack of manpower to be represented at all the different meetings. That's going to be even more difficult now because to be able to travel, it just means you have to spend the extra 2 weeks in quarantine, be vaccinated, and so on and so forth. And that's going to deter so many of the developing and underdeveloped states from sending representatives into those meetings. And I agree with you about Article 6, but I do hope that it's not going to be papered over and hastily adopted, that it be properly thought through, because it's a mechanism that we all have to live with eventually. Yeah. And, I reserve the last word to Pak Penny.
Right, thank you. It's not an easy for me to respond. I mean, ASEAN certainly will be a spotlight in the COP26 for many issues, but one of it because the pressure for the core moratorium. And then, for the next 5 years, region still expected to have around 20 gigawatt coal coming. So, I mean, this is a huge pressure there. But my point is, ASEAN is also already showing the tremendous efforts. The statistic last year, I think, is one of the proof for that one, how we can also do better with renewable energy. So it doesn't mean we don't want to do that. We want to do that, and then we do that. But to really move to the speed, we need the support from all of the international cooperation. I mean, this is the key. So I hope it's a clear action after the COP26. It's not only the pressure for the ASEAN, but it's also how to make it into reality. So that will be my hope on the coming months. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining us on this discussion, especially to our discussants for taking the time to really examine the report and give your comments. And actually, it is the hope of ISEAS that through this report, we can present in an ASEAN collective voice. Because without this report, I think it'd be quite hard for us to, gauge the level of awareness and understanding towards climate issues in this region. And we certainly hope that this report will grow in years to come. We can get more of the respondents putting in their views from each of the 10 countries. My colleague has shared a link to the report. You can click through to that link to download a copy. And we hope that this will serve as your dinner discussion tonight. Speak to your peers, your family, your friends, and tell them about the urgency of the climate emergency. And with that, thank you again very much for joining us this afternoon. Goodbye.